Well, hello there. Welcome to the second section of Chapter 39, the stalemated 70s Oh Baby Disco. We're looking at a new team on the Supreme Bench, all the way through Arab oil embargo. We're going to stop right before Watergate. We're going to save Watergate for its own special video, so let's get into it. Domestically, you have Earl Warren, who you probably heard, you remember from the Warren Commission that investigated the President Kennedy's assassination. Earl Warren was appointed a justice of the Supreme Court in 1953, and he made a bunch of controversial rulings. He was appointed by Eisenhower, so he served for a very long time. You have Griswold, not Clark W. Griswold from Vacation, but Griswold versus Connecticut, which struck down the state law that banned the use of contraceptives, even by married couples, creating a right to privacy. The FDA, not the FDA, the Department of Drugs or whatever, the USDA, I think that's what it is, allowed birth control in '64, and they sued. It was allowed. Gideon versus Wainwright, 63, ruled that all criminals were entitled to legal counsel, even if they couldn't afford it, which then leads on to Escobedo and Miranda in 1964 and 66, ruled that those who were arrested had the right to remain silent. That's the Miranda rights, the Miranda warning. You have Engel versus Vital in the school district of Abington Township versus Shemp, 62 and 63, ruled that public schools could not require prayers or Bible reading. Reynolds versus Sims ruled that state legislatures would be required to reapportion according to population. And so Nixon got his chance to replace Warren. Warren retired in 1969, and he replaced him with Warren Burger, who served all the way through the 1980s. I know that for sure. Here's a sign here, Save Our Republic, Impeach Earl Warren. He did not like the liberal judicial activism of Earl Warren, which is ironic as he was appointed by a Republican in Eisenhower. The Supreme Court, by 1971, had 4 Nixon-appointed members. By the end of that year of 71, which is ironic because they're the ones eventually is going to help bring Nixon down. Yes, you're not. Your eyes aren't deceiving you. That's Richard Nixon with the king of rock and roll, baby. Elvis Presley. Like I like her much. Nixon on the home front expanded. You would think, being a conservative, you'd think he would want to downsize the government. He actually expanded Great Society programs, increased funding for Medicare, Medicaid, aid to families with dependent children, or AFTC. He also created the Supplemental Security Income, SSI, to give benefits to the poor, the aged, the blind, and disabled to help out people in need. His Philadelphia plan in 1969 required construction trade unions to establish quotas for hiring black employees. So they had to hire a certain amount of African Americans, which is eventually becomes affirmative action. He changed the definition of affirmative action to include preferable treatment for groups, not specifically individuals. This was upheld by the Supreme Court in Griggs versus Duke Power Company that suggested employers and schools had to hire and admit as many in proportion to the population. So if 20% of the population was black, 20% of your population or your workforce should be African American if they applied for the jobs. And so quickly, white people believed that there was reverse discrimination going on, not understanding white privilege. This is all kind of crazy things, and so I just tried to jazz it up with a picture of Nixon and Elvis. He did create the Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, or EPA if you watch the Simpsons movie. The Clean Air Act in 1970 and the Endangered Species Act in 1973, both aimed at protecting and preserving the environment. That's good. In the 70s, the late 60s, early 70s, people realized, like, hey, we're killing the planet. We need to, stop dumping things in rivers and polluting. That controversy, that issue is still in the forefront today in 2020. The first Earth Day was held April 22nd, 1970, which, as I'm making that's almost 50 years ago this month. He also passed the Occupational Health and Safety Administration, or OSHA, which set safety guidelines for workers. The Consumer Product Safety Commission, the CPSC, in 72 protected consumers against dangerous products, which I remember SNL used to have a fun time with. Dan Aykroyd would do all these children's toys like Bag of Glass and things like that, and Halloween costumes, Invisible Pedestrian. If you get a chance, check out the SNL app and look at those. They're really good. These agencies gave the federal government more control over business. So Government's getting larger under Nixon, a conservative. Usually conservatives want the government to be smaller. But this is the era of the United States' big government, which continues to this day 50 years later. Inflation grows in the early 1970s. Prices are going up, and so Nixon imposes a 90-day wage freeze. He took the nation off the gold standard again, devaluing the dollar. Nixon's Southern strategy helped him win the Southern vote, trying to appeal to law and order in the South. This strategy consisted of opposing civil rights for African Americans. Good job, Nixon. Stuff up here, not bad. Down there, not so good. So in the spring of 72, North Vietnam, the North Vietnamese burst through the demilitarized zone separating two Vietnams. Nixon orders strategic massive bombings on strategic centers, halting the North Vietnamese offensive. Senator George McGovern won the 1972 Democratic nomination. His campaign promise was if he was elected, he would pull all the troops out of Vietnam in 90 days. So the Vietnamization of the war, the Peace with Honor plan, this is 4 years later, it's still going on. The Vietnam War is still dragging on, and Nixon's kind of getting worried that he's obsessed. He's actually paranoid that he's going to lose his re-election bid. He did lose in the closest election in history to President Kennedy. He only won in 1968 by 500,000 votes. And so in 72, Nixon becomes obsessed with winning re-election, which is going to get him in trouble. We're going to get, the next video is going to have Watergate, and it has to do with this. He shouldn't have really panicked. He won in a landslide. The economy was doing okay, but there was this October surprise. Kissinger had announced a month before the election that peace was at hand between the Vietnamese and the United States. Nixon wins the election, and then the agreement quickly falls apart. And so some people think it was a ploy just by Nixon to get elected. Nixon, after this, orders a 2-week bombing campaign in North Vietnam in an attempt to get them back to the peace table. Finally, 3 days into his second term on January 23rd, 1973, North Vietnamese negotiators agreed to a ceasefire. Basically, the United States agrees to leave Vietnam. North Vietnam agrees to return the POWs, our prisoners of war, which are being held in Hanoi and the Hanoi Hilton. And so the United States tucks tail and leaves Vietnam, leaving the South Vietnamese to fend for themselves. And so the United States pulls out of the war. Our POWs are returned. The war doesn't end in Vietnam. It goes on for another 2 years between the Vietnamese nations, but U.S. involvement is done. This is a political cartoon. It's European attacks on the Vietnam War, showing poor Vietnam and all the invaders, imperialists, that are the liberators that over the years have tried to impose their will on Vietnam. This is from a German newspaper. So it was revealed, and we mentioned this before, that there were secret bombings of Cambodia that had been taking place since March of 1969. The public questioned the trust of the government. Like, how can we trust the government? This credibility gap with Johnson is continuing with Nixon. Nixon ended the bombings in June 1973, even though the U.S. supposedly pulled out in January 1973. Eventually, Cambodia is taken over by a cruel dictator named Pol Pot. And they commit genocide in the killing fields of Cambodia and kill over 2 million people over a span of 2 years. There are archaeological digs that are finding just mounds and mounds of bodies, of skulls, of bones from these cruel... the Khmer Rouge is what it's called, the regime of Pol Pot. In November 1973, Congress passes the War Powers Act, which is an important piece of legislation that really hasn't been challenged too much since then. The president has to notify Congress within 48 hours of any military engagement for any commitment of U.S. troops to foreign conflicts. If Congress does not approve of that, the troops have to return in 60 days. There's been a little scuttle between President Trump and Congress over some of this stuff, but nothing's come to fruition because of the Republican majority in the Senate. But this kind of this safeguard against Vietnam, that Gulf of Tonkin resolution gave LBJ a blank check and escalated the war, and Congress had no way to check it back. And so now, without congressional approval, the president can use the military, because they are the commander-in-chief. They have to notify Congress within 2 days, and if the engagement is not approved, troops have to leave in 60 days. And so this gives a new feeling of new isolationism. The United States is going to once again turn its back on the world. It's not really true. The draft officially ended in January 1973. It's the last time we've ever had a draft. They had that one-time draft. They're still bringing people, kind of sifting through all of that. In the Middle East, Arab-Israeli tensions. There had been war between the Arabs and the Jews, or the Israelis, in 1948, 1956, 1967. That's that Six-Day War we mentioned in the previous chapter. Israel made incredible territorial gains in all of these wars, largely because of the aid of the United States, the U.S. Dollars flowing into Israel, and also U.S. war materials, tanks, planes, you name it. They gained in the Six-Day War Western Jerusalem, the West Bank, the Golan Heights, the Gaza Strip, and the Sinai Peninsula. And so Israel, which was attacked on its Day of Independence, has been expanding because of U.S. Aid. And so this is why many countries in the Middle East really despise and resent the U.S.'s involvement in that neck of the woods. The U.S. is involved because largely, one, they wanted to protect Israel, but two, the Cold War. Israel was anti-communism. Some of these countries had communist leanings, they had socialist leanings, and took aid from the Soviet Union. The Palestinians, who were the ones kicked out of Israel, demanded their own country. They were promised that under the initial agreement of how Israel was going to be established. Jerusalem was supposed to be an international city, and none of this happened. And so in 1973, on one of the most holy and somber holidays for the Jewish faith, Yom Kippur, the Yom Kippur War was launched. Yom Kippur is a day of revelation. You're supposed to, sit and contemplate and think about your year's worth of sins and things like that, and it's just kind of a festival. So Egypt and Syria attacked Israel. The United States aids Israel and urges ceasefire when they threaten to attack Cairo. Israel once again begins gaining more territory. And so because of this is the big picture, and this is the thing that you probably want to star in your notes. OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Companies or Countries, puts an oil embargo on the United States. They start cutting the sale of oil to the U.S., which initially the U.S. thinks, whatever, we got plenty of oil, this isn't going to be a big problem. The ripple effects of this oil embargo last the rest of the decade. The energy crisis, the inflation, the stagflation, the problems with the U.S. economy can be largely traced back to OPEC's oil embargo. It causes huge economic problems and shortages. There's long lines for gas. Companies are running out of gas. I've heard of school buses going to track meets down in Grand Junction, and they actually had to park the bus at the gas station to ensure they had enough gas to get the kids home from the track meet. Because of this, there's the approval of the Alaskan pipeline right across some wilderness and wildlife preserves. They lowered the speed limit to save gas in this country to 55. That's on the interstate. So when I was a kid growing up, you could only go 55 without risking getting a speeding ticket. Sammy Hagar immortalized that with his song "I Can't Drive 55," which nobody can drive 55. It took forever to go, like a 3-hour trip from where we're at in Western Colorado to Denver. It took forever. And so it also led to the exploration of other energy sources, nuclear, and then oil shale. And so Western Colorado had a big boom for oil shale, especially in Parachute, in Rifle, and Meeker, and Rangeley. A lot of money was infused through Exxon. They planned this whole town, Alamo Mesa. And so that was all because of this oil embargo, which started all the way back in 1973. There's some good NBC News updates about the oil embargo. If you get a chance, check up on YouTube. They're about 6 minutes long. I'm going to skip that. And this is the Uncle Sam's bed of nails, lying on the back of the oil derricks of the Middle East. Depending on oil from foreign countries, put the U.S. At the mercy of other countries. We'll get into Watergate in the next one. I hope you enjoyed this. If you have any questions, let me know.